Hello, my name is Amy Richmond and I am a current student at the University of Glasgow studying a Masters in Fantasy Literature. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the ways in which we can read different kinds of houses in children's fiction, looking specifically at huts and castles and how they house emotive and narrative change. Fantastic children's literature often links the impossible to the realm of the understandable and the physical to make the magic accessible and approachable for a child audience. As it is a location directly linked to the children's worldview, the home has become a locus for children's fiction to ground itself in. In doing so, it can also transform a narrative into something fantastic and can be used as a means to explore personal growth. The union between the house and the person is not new to literary critique, but few do so as poetically and intimately as Gaston Bachelard in The Poetics of Space. By using poetics as a tool to analyse children's fiction, the role the house plays in child-centric narratives comes to the forefront. Today I will examine how the fantastic Bildungsroman HOWL'S Castle by Diana Wynne Jones can be read through the lens of Bachelardian spatiality. I will use direct analysis of the text, as well as engagement with and expansion of Bachelard and other critics, to suggest that the loci of personal narrative change in the novel are the conceptual spaces of the hut and the castle. The use of huts and castles is critical to the emotional growth and transformations of the heroine, with the former symbolising narrative progression and the latter character maturation. As previously mentioned, the main theory I will be applying today is the Poetics of Space by Gaston Bachelard. Originally written in French, Poetics theorizes that literary spaces have a unique rhetorical strength, and argues that conceptions of space can be used to understand the self. It utilizes close reading analysis and theoretical approaches to locate conceptions of self in the linguistic descriptions and emotions attached to spatial images. Bachelard posits that the house represents human understandings of the world at large as well as the intimate sphere, arguing that our house is our corner of the world, as has often been said it is our first universe, a real cosmos in every sense of the word. To understand space is, for Bachelard, akin to understanding oneself, indeed as is understanding poetry. The link between literary art, intimate space, and the self is clear throughout Poetics, and it is impossible after reading Bachelard to not make the same connections to literary analysis. He is understandably frequently referenced by other spatial critics, and his analysis of the house is particularly pertinent to the critique of children's fiction. Pauline Dewan wrote in accordance with his opinions, stating that houses do more than reflect the self, ultimately they define the individual. This notion is particularly seen in this following stipulation from Bachelard. There is ground for taking the house as a tool for the analysis of the human soul. Not only our memories, but the things we have forgotten are housed. Our soul is an abode, and by remembering houses and rooms, we learn to abide within ourselves. Now everything becomes clear. The house images move in both directions. They are in us as much as we are in them. In using Bachelardian theory with children's fiction, three main conclusions can be drawn. Firstly, the house is the first world a child encounters, and thus is the first world they use to understand both themselves and the wider world. Secondly, it is also the first environment in which they can encounter change, and therefore the changes in the environment reflect the changes in the self. And lastly, literary houses in children's fiction are telling of the child stage within the narrative and within their personal growth. So what of our primary text? Well, Howl's Moving Castle presents a narrative with movement between houses as its heroine matures and adapts. Both the starting and end houses correspond with the different spatial concepts of the hut and the castle, and there is a narratological progression between them within the novel. It follows Sophie Hatter, the eldest of three daughters, resigned to running the family hat shop before she is cursed by the Witch of the Waste, and moves into Howl's titular moving castle to try and break the curse. Sophie begins her adventure within her first home, her first universe, which represents the hermit's hut, a house defined by its emotive isolation and inside-looking outward perspective. Her existence there is immediately defined by the centralized solitude of the hut, within which she cannot grow. For the hut is a universe outside the universe. The hut can receive none of the riches of this world. A lamp is waiting in the window, and through it the house, too, is waiting. The lamp is the symbol of prolonged waiting. The hermit's hut exists separately to the world outside, the narrative, and the lamp within it symbolises the prolonged waiting for change, the hut's prolonged stasis. There's an equal comfort and anxiety in this stasis, and a reluctance and inability to move beyond it. The hut's very nature is to embody simple emptiness. The hut appears to be the taproot of the function of inhabiting. It is the simplest of human plants, the one that needs no ramifications in order to exist. The motive emptiness of the hut makes it a location of inertia, and its mundanity makes movement reluctant. But the novel cannot progress from a place of emotional and narrative stasis. This theory has not been applied point for point to children's literature before, but its relevance cannot be disputed. For Dewan stipulates that in many classic children's novels, the move to or away from home by the protagonist signals some form of character development. So, to condense that theory, I've determined that there are three conditions for a house to qualify as a hut. Firstly, it is a physical location defined symbolically by emotive isolation and the absence of forward movement. Second, it is the first location of change at the hand of an outside instigator. And lastly, this change must evict the protagonist from the hut into the narrative. So, what does this actually look like in a narrative? Well, in Howl's Moving Castle, Sophie's childhood home can be considered her hut. There she is out of place amongst her sisters, acting as a mother whilst her stepmother works in the hat shop, and fated to be the least successful in life. Her isolation begins before the narrative opening as an emotive one, a feeling of displacement amongst peers, but it is not heightened nor an evicting force until the death of her father. After his passing, her sisters are given jobs elsewhere and exist beyond the house. That was all Sophie heard of her sisters for quite a while. But she must stay as the apprentice in her stepmother's hat shop. It is then in her physical as well as emotive isolation that the hut becomes a repressive place of stasis. She sits apart from customers in the hat shop, trimming hats, leaving her feeling isolated. Her near constant emotive seclusion pushes her to find community where possible, and as a result, Sophie talked to hats. There was no one else much to talk to. Unaware of the magic her words possess, Sophie's need for communication imbues magic into the hats and draws attention from the Witch of the Waste, who becomes an instigator of change. It is the witch's curse transforming Sophie into an older woman that pushes her outward beyond the hut she is disinclined to leave, finding its dullness a safety. She thought she would find time next day to go to talk to Letty, but she did not go. Either she could not find the time, or she could not find the energy, or it seemed a great distance to the market square, or she remembered that on her own she was in danger from Wizard Howl. Anyway, every day it seemed more difficult to go and see her sister. It was very odd. Her stability in the hut keeps her there, and she feels unable to leave, even for the simplest of trips. She's physically unable to leave, and even when she does, she feels the desire to return to the hut. Until she is forcefully evicted, her life and emotions are suspended in the hut. The curse is the first direct act of narrative change in Sophie's life, and the house then becomes uninhabitable as a result, unable to adapt to house the maturation of her body and subsequent maturation of her character to come. Therefore, movement from the hut not only signals progression outwards into the plot, but is an essential force for Sophie's growth and maturation as a character. The emotional climax of maturation comes later in the narrative for the heroine, after her departure from the hut. The move from the hut to the castle is a move towards adulthood and a progression into personal transformation. In fact, the castle itself represents a kind of hut, as well as a step beyond. Joyce Thomas calls it the hut magnified on a grand scale, so grand that it looms less as any collection of dwellings than as a carved Baroque mountain top. If the hut is a place of seclusion and stasis, the castle is a place of forward progression and of facing fears. It is change magnified. The hut therefore is the instigator of narrative progression, while the castle is the locus of transformation. Bachelard locates the castle's narratological worth in its educative value, claiming that the recluse must learn to conquer fear within its walls. Admittedly, the castle only briefly enters Bachelard's realm of focus, but its role in conjunction with the hut is paramount to spatial readings of fantasy. Just as the hut does not have to be a physically isolated shack in the woods, as the name might suggest, Sophie's hut certainly does not fit that description, the castle does not have to be a sprawling fortress of carved stone. The castle instead is a symbolic location, a building of greater size and emotional weight than the hut, making it a locus of narrative climax and personal transformation. It is where protagonists may come into their own and learn to trust themselves. It is the moment between moments described by Maria Tatar, when the fairy tale hero moves from a lowly condition at home to a world of enchantment and finally back to a modified and elevated form of his original condition. The moment of elevation, of self-growth, of maturation, between enchantment and home again. In its role as a locus of transformation, its existence is migratory. It must adapt with the transformative powers it possesses. A rigid world cannot house change. The castle must be able to adapt for the protagonist to grow. There is an irony in the transient existence of a solid image of stone in ages past, and typical readings of the castle argue its stability and resilience to be its defining feature. Thomas argues that the castle functions in fairy tales as a symbol of royalty and ultimate success, embodying all success within the tangible form of hewn stone, wealth and dominion, kingship and a royal marriage, safety, security, happiness. However, the castle within the fantastic Bildungsroman houses the climactic acquisition of safety and success. It itself is not a locus of security, but in surpassing the trials within the castle, the protagonist is granted security. In this way, the castle is the trial within which self-transformation is achieved. It functions the same way as Disney's opening image of the castle, according to Michelle, Anya, and Jairbug. In order to access the story, viewers must enter the castle. In order to access transformation through ordeal, the protagonist must enter the castle. It builds its transformative power through its containment of ordeals, as suggested by Bachelard in his analysis of Rainer Maria Rilke. It is inured by its trials. The castle capitalizes its victories over hurricanes. Again, to condense that pretty dense theory into a digestible format, the castle must be a physically large, imposing location. The protagonist must face a trial within it that allows them to grow. It must be able to adapt to house the change, and it must be the location of the climactic acquisition of safety. HOWL'S castle evidently fits this description. After her eviction from the hat-shop hut, Sophie finds herself at the doors of the terrifying wizard Howl's castle, which was already painted in the novel as a visage of fear. A tall black castle blowing clouds of black smoke from its 4 tall, thin turrets. People got very scared indeed. Nobody went out alone, particularly at night. What made all the scarier was that the castle did not stay in the same place. Sometimes it was a tall black smudge on the moors of the northwest. Sometimes it came right downhill to sit in the heather only just beyond the last farm to the north. You could actually see it moving sometimes, with smoke pouring out from the turrets in dirty grey gusts. Through its depiction as a looming threat, HOWL'S castle is painted from the beginning of the novel as a locus of emotive, transformative ordeal for Sophie, the fantastic location of a trial of her strength. Initially, the language used to describe the castle portrays it as a threatening force, moving both closer to and further from the town to strike fear into the residents, known to house a dangerous wizard. He was known to amuse himself by collecting young girls and sucking the souls from them, or some people said he ate their hearts. He was an utterly cold-blooded and heartless wizard, and no young girl was safe from him if he caught her on her own. However, as previously suggested, it is in Sophie's hut where change strikes her first, and with the curse-afflicted transformation, she loses her fear of the castle. Despite previously being afraid to venture into the town for the risk of Howl, Sophie finds herself not particularly frightened of his castle anymore, and rationalizes entering because Wizard Howl is not likely to want my soul for his collection. He only takes young girls. Thus, it is evident that the initial transformation of Sophie begins in the hut, losing her fear of Howl and coming into her own as an older woman. But her emotional growth is yet to occur. She encounters several trials during her time in the castle, but it is the slow maturation of her character through interactions with Howl that are housed in the castle. Her change is not immediate, but gradual, as her understanding of herself, of her curse, and of her relationship with Howl all grow. She comes into her own late in the narrative, when she can grapple with the realization that her transformation is in her own hands. After struggling with self-confidence and self-perception for the duration of the novel, Sophie hits rock bottom, accepting her role as the eldest, as a failure, to which Howl retorts that she just never stops to think. This marks the turning point in Sophie's maturation. Although she is physically old, she continuously behaves within the bounds of her mental age, acting without thinking. After her revelation, she thinks for an instant before reacting, and is able to turn the tide of the climax, saving Howl. Howl's castle is the house within which Sophie and Howl's relationship evolved, and her self-belief grows. Her climactic maturation is nested in her time within the castle. Thus, the castle has fulfilled its role as the educative locus of her growth, and the curse breaks, granting her security and leaving her able to return home to her family and her body. As Bachelard wrote, the cosmos molds mankind. It can transform a man of the hills into a man of islands and rivers, and the house remodels man. The castle allows for change within it, and it too remodels its heroine. It is also significant that the castle is a physically nomadic location. Clearly posited as the locus of Sophie's trials, the movement inherent to the castle grounds its nature in the shifting and transforming of identity. Indeed, its movement is linked to its relationship with Howl, rootless to the world but rooted to his emotions, acting as a vehicle of escape for the wizard. Arguably, it is both Howl's hut and his castle. It is a place of stasis that he is initially reluctant to leave. He did not seem to want to leave the hills. This is until Sophie acts as his instigator and breaks his contract with Calcifer, the fire demon who possesses Howl's heart. She took hold of Calcifer and carefully nipped him off the black lump. She carefully put the lump on Howl's chest. The heart went in. As soon as it had disappeared, Howl stirred about. The movement of the castle and its inherent permeability of control links it to the change of person and growth that occurs within it. As David Rudd suggests, the word moving metaphorically shifts the meaning of things, and consequently readers' viewpoints of them. The movement of Howl's castle, therefore, is a slightly on-the-nose metaphoric representation of the spatial castle in fantasy. It is physically permeable and adaptable, as much as the environment it fosters is, allowing Sophie, as well as the other inhabitants, to transform and mature. As this paper has shown, Bachelardian spatial theory can be adapted to a fantastic context to conceptualize the spatial housing of character maturation. In Howl's Moving Castle, the hut and the castle are loci of change, the hut heralding in the change of narrative direction for the protagonist, and the castle housing a change of emotional transformation. Clearly, the application of the spatial theory is particularly fruitful to understanding the maturation of characters in children's fiction such as the Bildungsroman. Other texts that could be analysed under this lens are Neil Gaiman's Stardust, Rick Riordan's Lightning Thief, and Caro King's Seven Sorcerers, amongst others. This line of analysis would not fit within the context of every novel within the genre, but it does suggest a significant influence of the spatiality within child-centric texts, and the benefit that using spatial analysis could bring. Evidently, Howl's Moving Castle shows a narrative where the house has become the topography of her intimate being, housing the maturation and transformation of its heroine. Here are all of my works cited. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me if you wish to discuss any of this further. All of my details are on the screen now. Thank you so much for listening.